Thank you very much. I realize that it's late in the day, and you have already had an exercise to keep yourself awake. And so, in that regard, my task is both easy and quite difficult. How to entertain you, and unfortunately, because of other kind of commitments, I don't have bells and whistles in my presentation. No pictures, unfortunately, just text. And in some ways, it is a pity that I'm pretending to lecture to you. This ought to be a conversation. You know a lot about the same histories from different perspectives. I agree very much with Rick. I'm presenting only a partial from my perspective. It is not the final truth. The kind of history that I find interesting is the one that asks more questions than it pretends to provide answers. All right. The task here, let me scroll this, is to examine quite a number of things, land and labor in the early 20th century, and in particular to focus on the Native Land Act, 1913, and the Native Trust Land Act. I'm glad Rick has already, and the various groups have already talked quite a bit about this, but most importantly, I think a point that he made, and I wondered why he was still asking me to come and talk about this, was the distance between official thought and affecting reality. The Land Act of 1913 is one act that has often been conflated with reality. In other words, it has been taken to represent reality as soon as it was passed. And if you think about land restitution, the 1913 cut-off point assumes that, in fact, land dispossession took place in 1913 with that act. As Michel pointed out, 17 centuries to from the 1700s to the 1800s, that's when dispossession took place. The act does something else rather than dispossess anyone directly. The dispossession had already taken place. But the point about acts, there was the discussion about the Tomlinson Commission. And here again is an instructive case. We often sometimes assume that 1948, the National Party is elected, they have the whole thing worked out. The length of that commission reflects something about the debate within the different groups. The purists who wanted blacks to be completely out of white South Africa, and others who had a more technocratic position. Similarly, as I will talk about this, 1913 Land Act is passed, but one provision was that there will be the Beaumont Commission. 23 years it took for provisions that will extend 7% of the land reserved for Africans in 1913 to the 13% that we often talk about with the passage of the 1936 Act. So it is also indicative of struggles, of course, that people engaged in, and I will talk a little bit about that. What was the rationale, implementation, and impact? Again, I will not assume that this is all new. You know about it, and as Rick indicated, some of us have a direct experience of this act. However, I can assume that since this is the earlier part of the 20th century, the 1900s, not many of us were alive then. What is the broader policy framework and relationship to cheap labor supply, mines, farms, and industry, right? And the structure of the South African economy? It is impossible to understand the forces that were pushing for the passage of certain acts without understanding something about the changes that were occurring within the economy. Assumptions that the Land Act resulted in the termination of sharecropping, for example, assumed that there were certain types of commercial farmers who could pay a wage, and therefore they did not need sharecroppers. They did not need labor tenants. But you can see how when the economy changes and there is more commercialization, the potato farms, you can see how the labor needs also begin to inform this act in various ways. So I will give a snapshot picture of how the economy changed, dominated as it was by gold mining, and then agriculture as well as secondary industries or manufacturing. All right. Sometimes I start talking and I go too fast. If I am, please stop me, and if there's a question at any point, do ask me to go over it. So the objectives really to present different perspectives of the 1913 and 1936 Land Acts and their consequences. I will spend quite a bit of time on this to examine popular responses to the Land Act in different settings. I'm glad I'm not spending as much time on this because from your groups you have already done this. But I'll say a couple of things. One, in the 1920s, the most important organization wasn't the by then it had not yet changed its name to the African National Congress. It was something called the ICU. Started as an urban workers' organization. By the 1920s, it's completely country. It is talking about the impact or the plight of labor tenants. It completely overshadows the ANC at the time. Secondly, it would be a mistake to reduce popular responses to segregation, to organizations. Organizations capture only a slice of what people think and how they react. If we assumed that organizations capture the totality of popular responses, we'll be suggesting that they are mass organizations. And of course, we know the story of the ANC by the 1930s. It's only when the Youth League came into being that they tried to turn into a mass organization. The reach, in other words, of these organizations is limited. The ICU is one exception, and even the ICU did not reach the northern parts. Natal, very present, northwest, eastern Transvaal, quite prominent there. Right. What were the linkages between land dispossession, taxation, and labor provision? Again, this is an issue that has been touched upon, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. A snapshot of the economy. Again, this is more for my purposes, but this is how I was thinking about it, and I got this from the brief that I was provided. How did the Natives Land Act undercut black people's recovery from dispossession? And the assumption here is that dispossession had already taken place. Impact on sharecroppers and labor tenants, and the role of the Native Trust and Land Act of '36 in the consolidation of reserves, and the entrenchment of traditional leaders as extension of native administrators, colonial native administrators. All right. The implementation of betterment planning on trust land, and a progressive co-option of chiefs. I've already talked about this, but betterment planning is part of what you have talked about already. Lastly, it is the question of urbanization. We have had Section 10. A major change in the Union of South Africa is not the structure of or the percentages of the makeup of the population, as is as it is the story throughout the world, it is the story of urbanization. And apartheid tries to reverse urbanization by only limiting those who had Section 1A rights, but the vast majority are to be contained in Bantustan. And so I will talk a bit about that too. Let me start with perspectives on the Land Act. And again, the assumption here is that the details are fairly clear, and I'm just giving a range of positions on how the Land Act has been thought about over time. I start with the official, and again, this is a gross simplification. But for those who thought about this law, it was seen as something that was benign and in fact was beneficial to those who were on whom this law was going to be imposed. Michel talked about social Darwinism. By 1905, the idea of a civilizing mission that had guided colonialism in what will become South Africa is rejected. Why? Because the thinking was that, well, these people, that's the phrase, it will take them a long time to change. They are traditional, and therefore they should be allowed to evolve according to their own pace. No heroic measures, to quote from the 1905 document, no heroic measures ought to be taken to force them into modern society. And of course, this denies the fact that people, labor migrants, were already part of the modern society in some fashion. And so this perspective argues that the reservation of land, however small it was, and the recognition of customary law, which goes along with the reversal of the rejection of the civilizing mission. With civilizing mission, chiefs are not recognized because you want to eliminate everything that is supposed to be against civilization and Christianity. But when you reverse the civilizing mission, you want to preserve what are considered customs and traditions. And so the story begins where Africans, natives, are considered to have customs and traditions, and these traditions are unchanging. Unfortunately, some of us talk about the same things as if they don't have a history. Again, Michel has touched on this with custom creation in the 1800s. This is what I was talking about earlier, sorry. The preservation of traditional ways, beneficial. Then we have perhaps one of the very first responses to 1913 Land Act, Soplaki, of course. And it is important that his scholarship wasn't just scholarship for its own sake. It was scholarship that was part of mobilization. Native life is about mobilizing the British public, to which the many elites of the South African National Native Association believed they were part of. They were citizens of the British Empire. It was convincing them about the negative impact of a law that they thought was beneficial. And for Saul Plaatje, Native Land Act, he might hedge at some point that yes, there were no magistrates to enforce this law, but at the same time, he talks about the great dispersal of blacks from white-owned land. He talks about it as revolutionary change with one stroke. I mean, very evocative language. The native is turned into a pariah. That's great dispersal. That's a revolutionary change. That is occasioned by the Land Act. For him, even though he is aware, Kumisho Mukwerane is writing a history of the Mulemas, and Saul Plaatje was very much part of this elite land-owning African in present-day Free State. are familiar with the dispossession of the 19th century. But because Platy is also involved in mobilization at the time, he talks about the Land Act as an act of dispossession. Of course, in metaphorical terms, it is an act of dispossession because it formalized prior forms of dispossession. But in terms of its intention, there is no land that it is dispossessing anymore. All the land has been dispossessed, as I've been saying. And for for Blackie, the pressure for this Land Act comes from rural Afrikaner landowners. And so the assumption is that the landowners don't want sharecroppers. They don't want land tenants, hence the dispersal. And again, those of us who have read his book could not have been moved by scenes of dislocated people being thrown out of farms. Some with livestock, their livestock dying on the way. That's the story Platy presents. And this is informed by the idea that Afrikaner landowners were against sharecropping. But this is a story that also suggests the impact was immediate as well as harsh. Platy's book is crucial. One engages with it critically not because it's not important. It is important, but it does cover some of the complexities that within the Free State about which he was writing about in the Northern Cape. This puzzle was not even. In some districts, the settlement patterns of Africans on white-owned land remain very much in place. It's not disturbed at all. It is only among some landowners, those who were rich, who were able, in other words, to compete against the smaller farmers. The majority, who were smaller farmers with limited means, cannot afford to do without the share from the labor tenants. They cannot afford to pay a wage because many of them can hardly make a living out of farming. For the majority, it's only after the 1930s. In fact, if you go further north, where I did my research, it's only after the 1940s that most white farmers can begin to make a living out of agriculture. Agriculture is hard. It's not easy. All right. One of the perspectives that in some ways borrows from Platy is the cheap labor thesis, which identifies the Land Act as the major cause of this. And Harold Wolpe and Bernard Magubane might be identified as the major proponents of this, Harold Wolpe in particular, in which he sees the Land Act as official attempts at preserving something of the traditional society, but at the same time destroying it and destroying peasants. The preservation is in the sense of the reserves, but those reserves are destroyed, or land outside of the reserves destroys the ability of peasants to subsist autonomously, and as such, this is tied to the production of cheap labor. And he argues that this is why the mine employer can pay very low wages, because the workers still have a home to go to where they grow crops, and out of those crops they are able to reproduce themselves, they are able to feed themselves, and as such, miners or mining capital only has to pay a tiny fraction of of their cost of reproduction. And it is in this sense that it is known as the cheap labor thesis. And so you can see the connection from one perspective that has been drawn that again official acts are read as producing the views or the wishes of government, but that rarely happens because, as we shall see, others have talked about how, in spite of the 1913 Land Act, peasants were able to rise, but they only fall later, as it were. So in this instance, we have a thesis, we have a perspective that stresses in much the same way, perhaps, as Saul Plaatje did, the ability of the state to reshape social realities, largely through legislation. And that's a limited view. The act is merely an intention. We are not dismissing its fundamental importance because it does provide the framework, but nonetheless, the realization of its intentions are not, as was pointed out earlier, are not always immediate. There is, as the British would say, there are many slips betwixt the lip and the cup. So you have the same thing in reality. So here's one perspective that thinks especially about this in the sense of mining capital. It's not rural as Saul Plaatje thought of it, landowners. So it is the mining capital here that will call for the that will be seen to have been responsible for pushing for the passage of the 1913 Land Act. But of course, there is evidence that the mining companies were actually not very keen on having this act passed quickly, and that is related to the economy of South Africa at the time. Harold Walter and Bernard Maguvane represent the radical perspective, and this perspective is further illustrated by Colin Bundy, who again challenged the view of Africans as traditional, and using underdevelopment theory argued that until there was state intervention to assist white farmers for the interest of capital, there was in fact a rise of an African peasantry. And this peasantry, looking specifically in the Eastern Cape, Herschel district, said that it rose and responded positively to market opportunities. Why did it not survive? It did not survive because the 1913 Land Act undercut it. And here again we have we have an example of how acts are read as having an immediate and revolutionary change. One of the most interesting interventions in agrarian history in the 1970s and 1980s was Mike Morris, who was arguing more specifically, even more than Colin Bundy, from a Marxist perspective, and sought to date the precise moments when capitalist agriculture occurred in different parts, or rather in South Africa. And this happens when tenancy and other non-wage forms of labor are ended. And they are ended largely through legislation such as the 1913 Land Act. So for Morris, there is a proletarianization. In other words, workers in the on the farms are no longer labor tenants. They are not sharecroppers. They earn a wage. They are proletariats, very much like those working in urban areas. And he argues this happens by the 1930s. But the most important point is how this is seen to flow from state actions, such as those related to the Land Act of 1913. Mining capital, as I indicated here, is seen as particularly important. The impact is wide-ranging and quite immediate. The recent a lag between the passage of the act as well as its consequences. Historians like to argue a lot. Uh, in the 1980s, we have a perspective that has come to be known likely as social history. Uh, uh, Keegan, looking at the Orange Free State, very much the areas that Paul Fleischer was reporting about presented a more mixed picture. And instead of or rather, he also saw these changes and the relationship to the Native Land Act in terms of this push towards agrarian capitalism. And that if you can map areas within a particular region that are moving towards greater commercialization, greater capitalism, then you can also see a direct relationship with the persistence of sharecropping, labor tenancy. So this does modify sort of like this picture. It does confirm at one level that in some areas there is indeed an immediate impact on labor tenants. But that even when it is confirming the dispersal thesis, actually adds a twist that in some instances it was not so much the farmers chasing people as much as the tenants exercising the agency. They have a lot of livestock, and the farmers want to have, because under the guise of this law, want to have control over them. They want more labor, they want more of their livestock, and then they moved out of the farm. So it is not as clear a picture as as Flashy perhaps would have, or Wolfe. The scale of evictions, limited. Keegan does something that few people had done, few scholars had done before then, where he tries to go through the archival records to see how many people are convicted for contravening the Native Land Act. I'm not suggesting that archives capture everything that happens. Again, they capture just a slice. One of the if I ever had that illusion that archives, you go to Pretoria and the archives, you think that they collect everything. I was disabused. I knew of this, of course, but I was further disabused of this when a colonial official reporting from Lloyd Richard said, well, I had written this report, monthly report, and it, while I was waiting to put it in an envelope, it was blown away by the wind. I'm not making it up. He might have been giving an excuse. He had not done the report. But a simple example where the wind would do away with what would have been an archive we would have relied on. In any case, Keegan, though, argued that the scale of evictions is not of a revolutionary level. It's not massive. There could be other evidence. So far, that evidence hasn't necessarily come up because, again, the archive is limited. Sharecropping, importantly, remained in the Free State rather than end, despite the passage of law and the fact that the Free State is recognized as one area, other than anywhere else where the Native Land Act did have an impact. As you know, the law is of no consequence in the Cape, right? Why was that? It could not. It was illegal. It could not be applied in the Cape Colony. Anybody remembers why that was the case? Until 1936, there is a franchise, the limited franchise in the Cape, and the basis of that franchise is what? Property. If this act is applied there, it will be undermining the franchise. So for that reason, it is not enforced in the Cape. So here again we have this picture where sharecropping remained because the vast majority of white farmers are not commercialized enough, do not have the means to rely on capital. They are not reducing on wages. They are not producing enough to exist to subsist on just their farming. So for that reason, sharecropping, tenancy, whatever you think of him, Charles van Onselen has written a very fascinating account, and it's an exceptional case where he's able to interview this individual, Cas Maine, a sharecropper over a long period of time. You get a sense of the difficulty of white farmers having it their own way, showing that some individuals are still able to, despite the existence of the Land Act, they are able to have some control over their lives. A critique of this, of many of these perspectives, and again I'm skipping over quite a bit here, is related to the Centenary Conference, 1913, in 2013, where Bernard and Villiers presented a paper in which again they reviewed the literature and argued that as important as the Land Act is, we have tended to put way too much into it and have thus missed some important historical events, land reform, land restitution being one of those. Land alienation, they argue, is not a major intention or outcome of the Act. They further argue that, if anything, it was an interim measure that was meant to maintain the status quo. What is the status quo? The status quo is one in which what is referred to as white-owned land is still not white man's land, because there are many Africans residing in those areas. On paper, it is white man's land, but in reality, settlement patterns, as Michelle suggested, are very different from what is emerging as the segregationist ideology, which is reflected in the law. And Bernard and Villiers argue here that, yes, it's a very important act, but let's put it in historical context and perspective. It is an interim measure because the commission, it provides for a commission, right, to set aside land, and until the land is set aside, scheduled areas, the law is not fully implemented in many areas. And it is for this reason that the 1936 Land Act was passed. Of course, the assumption was that within a few years of the Beaumont Commission submitting its report, such a law would be passed. But this is an intensely political issue. The Herzog Native Bill, you will be familiar with those that are rejected. Smart and the Unionists don't want to accept the particular version of segregation that Herzog wanted. And it's only a compromise in 1936. And it's a compromise, again, that is linked to the Cape Trenchard. But with the 1936, that comes to pass. And again, from the groups, you got you were talking about native representative councils and those kinds of things. So from this perspective, the Land Act has, in the short term, a very limited impact. But in the long term, modified by other laws, the Land Act, of course, has consequences that we are still dealing with. But it is recognizing, unpacking the historical processes. I think that helps us understand the legacy of the Native Land Act, and therefore formulate proper remedial action. But once you misunderstand the historical process, you're likely to, until recently, land restitution, as we know, could not go beyond 1913. That process has been opened up. Aninga has a view, and many others have a view about whether that is good or not, reopening it. But nonetheless, that's an issue. African land ownership outside reserves, something that the Land Act tried to do, still continued. The Western Transvaal, the Bafokeng, Royal Bafokeng, places where lots of land had been bought, and it's registered through mission societies and things of that sort. In other areas, the northern part of the then Transvaal, land purchases are very limited because that part of South Africa, of the Transvaal, comes into the colonial world very, very late. It's the story of African colonization is the story of Mpondoland, 1890s. And for that reason, land purchases further north are fairly limited. All right. So here, this again, I've not touched on all of the perspectives, but just a sense of some of the major views that have been expressed by it, short-term, immediate impact, and those that emphasize that in the short term, the impact is limited. And here again, I won't spend that much time on this because you have already talked about it in some fashion. The features of the Land Act, the control of tenancy on white-owned land, and how does it undermine recovery from dispossession. Certainly, the idea that Africans would not buy land outside of native locations or reserves undermines that process, or that they could not have access outside of the native locations. It is a confirmation through the evolving segregationist ideology that prevails until 1948. We cannot call the period before 1948 apartheid in any sense. They're different in certain respects. Reserves on native locations are never seen in the same way that they are seen in the apartheid period after the Tomlinson report, for example. Continued access to land through various forms of tenancy and sharecropping is something that Africans would have wanted to do, but the Land Act tries to limit this process. But as I said, this process does not succeed in the short term. It is one that takes a long time. In some regions, again, the north that I'm familiar with, 1960s, 1970s is when tenants are finally moved out of labor tenants, are moved out of white-owned farms, and so the regional variation is endless. Again, the control, forbidding of rent. Here's the link between Land Act and labor. Many of you know the 3 months. Most people, it took me, when I was doing research, it took me a while to understand what people were talking about. They kept talking about 3 months, 3 months. Of course, they were talking about 90-day service. I said, did you not work for 90 days? I said, no. It was 3 months. Of course, it's the same thing. But it taught me to listen to a particular kind of language that former labor tenants and sharecroppers used. And the point here, of course, is that access to land is tied to the provision of labor. But there are ways through which many people, even if they provided 90 days of labor, it is a generational thing often. The younger members of the family provide that labor, whereas others don't. They go and work in the labor month. They still retain the land. So it is the variations are endless. So the final point here that it retained the status quo. The settlement patterns of that were in place in 1913 are not rearranged in any significant way. If you buy the story of the revisionists, I will call them, Baynard and Dillius, about the Land Act. Why? Well, why this act is a key piece of segregationist and racist legislation? How is the native question going to be answered? unlike Australia, unlike North America, the native population is not eliminated. Not only that, it is the majority. But how do you incorporate it into colonial society? Civilizing mission, as I said, that is not the answer. And segregation territorially is what the 1913 Land Act is trying to do. The maintenance of those patterns, in other words, formalizing and entrenchment of dispossession that had happened before. And of course, this means the social Darwinism in which those who are at the top, or white supremacy, will be maintained. And the act assumes that the blacks will be in a subordinate position. They can access land in particular ways. They would not have the same rights as as those who are more evolved. All right. And the Native Trust and Land Act, again, I'm grateful that you have already touched this, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. I'll go quickly through this. It's still up somewhere in the slides that you presented. But this is a continuation, 23 years after the 1913 Land Act. Finally, there is a compromise. The compromise is to consolidate native locations or reserves. And the extra 6.3 million hectares then gives us the 13%, adding to the 7% that was originally set aside. Here's the point. Traditional leaders are now, the 1927 Native Administration Act is important. But until the Native Trust and Land Act is passed, the entrenchment of chiefs as part of colonial administration is still fuzzy. But with the Native Trust and Land Act, with no prospect of the extension of the franchise, the Cape franchise elsewhere in the Union, chiefs' own institutions are to be used for the expression of political will of the natives. That was the thinking, and of course, the Native Trust will achieve this through the purchase of additional land and the administration of the reserve land. And this is where things like the betterment planning. Why betterment planning? This goes back to the Native Economic Commission of 1932, where the reserves are blamed for the the really bad conditions that were already showing in the 1930s because of limited land. So there is overcrowding, dense settlement, livestock does not have enough grazing land. The commission, though, understood that as an indication of the backwardness of the native residents. Hence the introduction of betterment planning. It is because there is no division of arable and grazing land. They're all mixed up. If you divide it, then it will be the level of degradation will be limited. Livestock. This had nothing to do, as Rick mentioned, had nothing to do with diseases. It's purely about numbers. The livestock that Africans have are of a poor quality, it's argued, and there's no prospect of it ever increasing because it's called scrub. Maintaining it is uneconomic. This is where that whole idea by anthropology that Africans worshipped God, the God with a wet nose, comes from that. These people just keep cows. You know why? Why do they keep cows? Cattle? Lobola. That's why but they don't keep them for anything else, for economic purposes. So betterment planning is supposed to bring about changes to what is understood as backward uneconomic behavior, instead of addressing the issue of the limited land within which people were supposed to make a living, division of land. But again, I'm not that old. Well, okay, I'm over 50. Um, this is 1936, right? 1950. This law in the area where I grew up is only introduced at the time when I was a teenager. Um, the division of land. But the Eastern Cape, by the 1930s, it is introduced to a large degree, whereas in other parts of the Union or the country, they are not introduced. Fences dividing my grandmother's field just being cut off like that. Neighbors who lived, people who used to live on the other side of the river, being removed and brought on top of us. And from then on, my grandmother kept talking, complaining about chickens being stolen and witches living right on top of us. Witchcraft, I'm not even going to try and apologize for witchcraft because it does exist. She believes it anyway. But it is also an indication of how this betterment plan had changed settlement patterns. And the way in which she speaks about its effects is through witchcraft. And of course, the part of the reason was because these people were now settling on part of what used to be one of a field, which is no longer considered to be arable land, but now residential. And on the other side of the road, what used to be a field had been divided into two, arable and arable and grazing. So for her, this was direct and quite dramatic. And I remember this quite directly, even though I'm not that old. All right. But of course, there is also the with the Native Act and the Masters and Service Contract Act, the idea of controlling squatters and distribution of labor tenants. Again, in the North, one section of a chapter of a thesis I wrote some time ago, the South Fransbeck, a district had to apply to government in order to apply Chapter 7 of the 1936 Act, which was to limit labor tenants. The arguments that a lot of the Farmers Association are saying is that no, this is bad, you can't do this. If you do it, I'm not going to have any labor on my farm. But when you look at who is making the demands, you realize that these are the emerging commercial farmers, whereas the poorer ones did not want to have anything to do with it. Black spots, part of the Native Land Act. Again, let me not spend too much on this and look at other aspects. I'm hoping, and I'm aware of a bit of the disorganization that you don't have to tell me, but I'm hoping that it fits into what you have already been talking about, in addition to what you already know. And here I'm just going to also provide some context within which these laws are occurring. And the changes in the South African economy are important. And I focus on the period from 1910 to 1948. When the modern state of South Africa is created in 1910, there was an undisputed sector in the economy, and this sector was mining. So from 1886, diamonds are replaced by gold, and they become the dominant part of mining. And up until 1910, this is the dominant sector of the economy. Because of mining, there is an infrastructure, largely on railway network, but it is limited. It's largely determined by the mining industry. It is not linked to a nationwide transport network. And in some ways, even talking about a nationwide transport network is ahistorical, because until 1910, Transvaal existed as Transvaal, on and on, as we know. And in fact, up until the 1920s, the manufacturers cannot think about a national market. They think of it in very regional terms. Okay. Technologically, the mining industry was not only dominant because of the large numbers of people that it employed, but technologically, it is the most advanced in the South African economy. I had a comment earlier when I came in about the supposed conflict between the modern and the traditional. I think sometimes we draw two stark. I'm not sure how many people wake up and say, today I'm traditional and today I'm modern. They just live their lives in very complex ways. And the story of mining, and gold mining in particular, is one that has the coexistence of what is supposed to be pre-modern and backward forms of labor. It is the most technologically advanced, but at the same time, you know the story. It relies on unfree labor. Technology and industrialization and therefore modernization go hand in hand. The expectation is that the labor will also be modern. It will rely on wage labor, but it's an unfree form, migrant labor system. So there is a paradox there. What about other sectors? Agriculture, the islands of commercialization, but they're largely in the oldest of the colony. You can see this through exports. It's technologically very backward, and we can measure this through the number of tractors or wages. Export is another way of measuring it. Wool and ostrich feathers. Those are the exports of the agriculture. Otteron, wool, the Cape. By the 1920s, both of these exports are wiped out. And so agriculture is largely very limited. Secondary industry is also the same story, very, very modest level. Whatever existed would have been largely to service the mining industry. But consumer goods, yeah, everything is imported. The significant factor in the South African economy is the way in which the state is seen as an important actor in transforming the regional economies and creating a national economy. And the state does this, yes, through legislation, but it also does it through the creation of institutions. HCOM is created out of the state, parastatals. ISCO, which we sold because we're in the neoliberal age, even though by 2010 we needed the steel for constructing stadia. These are created around the 1920s, where the state, even though it's a free market economy, the state's role is considered important. So it plays both a regulating as well as an interventionist role in the economy. And we'll see this role in the 1920s, especially in the 1930s. The Great Depression ends whatever economic growth happens in the 1920s. There is indeed growth in the 1920s that leads to the expansion of white settlement, for example, in the area where I did my research. Michelle was talking about Palabora being surveyed in the 1920s. So far northern part of the Soutpansberg, 1920s is when the land is surveyed. And large numbers after World War I, large numbers of fairly poor white settlers are introduced, many who failed by 1933. But perhaps the most important driver of economic change in the case of South Africa, is the abandonment of the gold standard. It took many years, Herzog resist this, but finally he does. We are familiar with the gold standard, right? Where that promise on currency, if it's 10 rand, the central bank is supposed to have an equal amount in gold. That's what had to reduce it to its simplest form. That's what the gold standard meant. But Britain had already left the gold standard because of the Great Depression and many other countries, and South Africa had remained in that. And with the currency not tied to the value of gold, a lot of things happened. The the value of gold skyrocketed. And it is in this context that Anglo-American emerged as a giant, a South African-based company that was able to mobilize capital from London, but its founder, Ernest Oppenheimer, saw himself, even though he's a recent immigrant, as a South African. It is through Anglo-American that the very costly Western and Eastern Rand gold is exploited, because he was able to mobilize a lot more of the cash. But more importantly, by the late 1930s, Northern Orange Free State, new gold fields are discovered there, which together, especially the abandonment of the gold standard, lifted South Africa immediately out of the Great Depression. And it is in the midst of that of that boom that you have other changes in the economy, agricultural growth and commercialization, because it is feeding into a growing urban population. It is feeding into an economy that needed the agricultural produce. But more importantly, the state is able, for the first time, to provide funding. What do they call them? Dairy boards, for example. After 1932 that are set up. In other words, crops are identified as important, and there is a board for the promotion of those. More importantly, they control prices, so that farmers can subsist. Bananas, later on, would have a board of it. If you do not belong to that board, if your area is not declared by that board to produce that particular crop, it won't find access to the market. And we can also see this dramatic change in agriculture through the what economic historians call tractorization, simply the number of tractors. In 1918, there are only 230 tractors. It's not because they are not tractors, but the number of farmers who could use them. By 1946, there are over 20,000 tractors. The mechanization of agriculture. Industrial growth, secondary manufacturing also happens to a greater degree in several areas. First, mining. Chemicals are no longer imported but are produced locally. But there are consumer goods, garments and textiles that move to the coastal areas in particular to exploit cheap labor, Cape Town, Natal, that begin to emerge around this time. From the 1930s, or something else happens. More whites are employed in the mining industry in supervisory roles. But there is an even more important change in the recruitment of labor, especially in the mines. Tropical natives. These will be laborers that are systematically now being employed. Yes, they have done so, they've worked in Kimberley and what have you, but after 1932, the mining industry is allowed to recruit tropical natives. Does anybody know why they were not allowed before 1932 to recruit them? There was a suspicion that they were they will get sick from what you call it, phthisis, more than others because they're from the tropics. So officially, the mining industry is not allowed to until 1932. But what is important is not that so-called tropical natives are coming in for the first time. It is the manner in which they come in. There is the recruitment is more structured. Crook's Corner, where the touts would recruit people moving, is replaced by a more systematic system, where the mining industry through Wenela, the Witwatersrand Native Labor Association, enters into an agreement with the colonial governments in Mozambique, in Nyasaland, What else happens? The miners never see their wages. Their wages are sent to those governments, and they have to go back to their countries of origin to get their salaries. So in some ways, the expansion of the reserve system as it existed internally in South Africa. And again, I'm not saying the so-called tropical natives were coming in for the first time. It is the way in which they're coming in. For the first time, large numbers and recruited under particular conditions. So those will be snapshot changes of the economy. Let me conclude by talking about the population. For the first time, a census is taken, 1911, which is quite appropriate. Nation states take census. They want to know where their people are. So a year after the formation of the Union of South Africa, just over almost 6 million people are found in the Union, all the people. By 1946, almost 12 million. The racial percentages remain largely constant, 25% white, 74, roughly speaking, and then you have Indian and colored and what would it, Asiatic would have been the word used at this time, will form the rest of the percentage. But as I indicated earlier, the major change really is the story of urbanization. And urbanization is not unique to the Union of South Africa. It is a worldwide story. If you listen to blues, American blues, you're listening to it because there's been a rural migration into Chicago during this time. This is a major change. From about 1910 to 1948, there is an increase from 18% to 30% of the urban population on average. 1951, 40% of the population is urban. So even a shorter time from a 3-year period, you have even larger numbers of people moving into urban areas. In racial terms, 1910, 50% of the white population is urban. By 51, this has gone to 75%. Indian and colored is predominantly urban. And it's for this reason that the idea of a homeland does not arise, especially in the Western Cape, because, they don't have culture in the apartheid sense. I'm not talking about in the broader sense. They don't have traditions. They don't have customs. It's predominantly urban. African, the population rises from 12.6 to 27.2 during the same period. And after that, there is an explosion. But as I indicated, this explosion is, there is an attempt to reverse that exploitation. The Schwarz-Gefahrt during the 1946 election is largely about urban migration. It has to be reversed. And Smart loses the election because he cannot come up with measures that will slow down the urbanization of blacks. And it is in this context, of course, that Bantustan that will entrench this territorial segregation are introduced. And so the story then of the second half of the 20th century really is one of trying to reverse not only the winds of change that are sweeping the continent of Africa in terms of decolonization. In South Africa, we reverse it. We have internal decolonization. We have Bantustan. But more importantly, it is the reversal of urbanization. And some argue that the end of apartheid happens something that you indicated in some of the groups. By 1986, influx control collapses. It didn't collapse because the state decided they were liberal. It collapsed because they could not effectively police people from moving between urban and rural. So to end, in part because I am a rural person, some urbanites tend to think of us as bumpkins, right? We are not very smart. But there isn't a neat and sharp break between urban and rural. It is the more complex linkages between the two. Thank you.